You felt it before you understood it, not as a thought, but as a weight that did not belong to your body, yet refused to leave it. You carried it anyway. You always did. And now something has already ended. You recognize this. There is a moment quiet, almost without event, when the voice you once held open for others no longer answers in the same way. It does not disappear. It withdraws behind something you cannot reopen. A door without sound, a voice that no longer moves outward. You did not decide this. It completed itself, and what you are left with is not relief, it is the residue. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not feel like tiredness. It feels like thickness, as if your inner space has been filled, layer by layer, with what was never meant to remain inside you. You learned early to make room, not metaphorically, structurally. Your psyche reorganized itself around the capacity to hold what others could not metabolize. Their fear, their confusion, their unspoken grief, these did not pass through you. They settled, and you adapted again and again in my patience. I saw this pattern emerge not as choice, but as necessity. The child who becomes the silent container, the one who listens without interruption, the one who senses what is unsaid and responds to it before it forms into language. This is not empathy as sentiment. It is empathy as function, a role assumed before the ego has fully formed. You were not asked, you were shaped, and what is shaped so early becomes indistinguishable from identity. You do not say, I carry others. You say, without saying it, this is what I am. But the psyche does not forget what it was not meant to do. It compensates. At first, the cost is invisible. You become effective, needed, indispensable in ways that are rarely acknowledged directly. People come to you without knowing why. They speak, and something in them relaxes, not because they have resolved anything, but because you have absorbed the tension they could not hold. And so the pattern continues, not as a burden, as a system. You learn to read before words are spoken. You anticipate emotional shifts before they surface. You adjust subtly, continuously, so that others do not have to confront what is inside them. This is the quiet architecture of your relationships. It is not built on mutual recognition, but on your capacity to contain. And for a time, this feels like connection, but it is not. It is asymmetry. The voice that moves toward you is full. The voice that leaves you is already emptied of what mattered. You are not met. You are used as passage. In my work on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, I observed that when the ego becomes overly identified with a function that serves the collective, especially one rooted in adaptation, it begins to lose its own boundaries, not visibly, not dramatically, but in small, cumulative distortions. The self is no longer experienced as center, but as medium. This is where the cost begins, not in collapse, in erosion. You begin to notice that your reactions are delayed, not because you do not feel, but because what you feel is layered beneath what you have taken in. Your own anger becomes indistinct. Your own sadness appears diluted. You cannot locate where you end and where the other begins, not philosophically, but experientially, and still you continue because stopping would require something you were never permitted to do, to let another person remain with what is theirs. There is a moment, though, and it does not arrive with clarity, when the accumulation reaches a point of no further integration. The psyche does not negotiate this. It simply ceases to cooperate. You may notice it first in your voice. It changes, not in tone, but in availability. Where once there was an immediate response, an adjustment, a softening, a translation, there is now a pause that does not resolve. You hear the other person speak, and something in you does not move to meet them. The door remains closed. You do not know how to open it again. And this is where confusion begins, not for you, but for them, because the system they relied on has failed. They do not name it as such. They call it distance, coldness, withdrawal. But what they are encountering is not a decision. It is the consequence of a structure that has reached its limit. You cannot carry more, not because you refuse, because there is no space left. The hallway inside you, once open, once extending further than you understood, has become obstructed, not by resistance, but by accumulation. You walk through it inwardly and find doors that no longer open, voices that echo without reply, rooms filled with what was never meant to remain. This is not metaphor. It is the lived architecture of your inner world. I have called this, in essence, the overburdening of the adaptive function, when the psyche is forced, over time, to maintain equilibrium for others. It sacrifices its own capacity for differentiation, and without differentiation, there can be no true relationship, only absorption. But absorption is not infinite. It ends, and when it ends, it does not end gently. It ends by withdrawing access. This is the point at which others begin to feel something they cannot name. They approach you as they always have, with expectation, with unspoken reliance, and encounter something unfamiliar, not hostility, not rejection, absence, a voice that no longer reaches them. They may speak more loudly, more urgently. They may attempt to provoke a reaction, to restore the previous dynamic, but the mechanism is no longer active. The door does not respond to pressure. It remains as it is, closed, and you, standing on the other side, are not guarding it. You are simply no longer able to open it. There is a dream that appears often in this phase. You are in a house you recognize, though it is not one you have lived in for many years. There is a room at the end of a narrow hallway. You know, without entering it, that everything you have carried is inside. You reach for the door, but it does not move, not locked, not resisted. It simply does not respond. And behind it, there is a voice. You cannot hear what it says. only that it is no longer yours to answer. This dream is not symbolic in the decorative sense. It is a direct expression of a completed process. The psyche has sealed what can no longer be integrated, not as protection, as necessity, and so you begin to live differently, not by choice, by limitation. The conversations that once extended effortlessly now feel shortened, not because you withdraw, but because there is no further space into which the other can extend themselves. They reach the boundary sooner. They feel it, though they may not understand it. And they react. Some will accuse you of changing. Some will attempt to restore the previous access by reminding you of who you were. The one who listened, the one who understood, the one who carried. But that version of you was not sustainable. It was constructed under conditions that no longer hold, and so it cannot return. There is another dream. You are standing in a long hallway, carrying a chair. You do not know where it came from, only that it has always been yours to carry. You move from room to room, offering it, placing it where others sit. But when you finally stop, when you set it down for yourself, you realize there is no place left to go. The hallway ends, and you are still holding the chair. This is the moment of recognition, not that you have been used, but that you have been structured around use, and what follows is not liberation. It is the collapse of that structure. You no longer know how to be with others in the way you once were, not because you lack care, but because the mechanism of carrying has defined the entire relational field. Without it, there is no template, and so there is silence, not imposed, structural. In my clinical observations, I saw that when such a function collapses, the individual is often left in a state of profound ambiguity. They are no longer who they were, but have not yet differentiated into a new form. This is not transition, it is suspension. You are still present, but no longer available in the same way. And this is what others feel most intensely, not your absence, but your presence without access. You are there, you respond, but something essential, the channel through which they once reached you, has closed. They cannot enter, and you do not reopen it, not because you refuse, because it no longer exists. This is the cost that was never named, not burnout, not fatigue, but the irreversible loss of the function that once made you necessary, and with it, the collapse of every relationship that depended on it. What makes this difficult to understand is that the collapse does not announce itself in a dramatic way. There is no single betrayal large enough to justify it. No final injury that explains the closure. What ends inside you ends through repetition, through the slow arithmetic of overuse, through years in which your psyche was treated as if it were a place with no walls. This is why, when the structure finally fails, even you may hesitate to call it by its proper name. You are tempted to describe it in softer terms: exhaustion, distance, a need for rest, but these words are too small. They suggest recovery. They imply that what has withdrawn will return after sufficient repair, yet what has happened is not restoration delayed, it is a psychic function reaching its end. And because it ends silently, others rarely see the event itself. They see only its consequences. They notice that your face no longer rearranges itself around their distress. They notice that your voice, once able to absorb urgency without resistance, now meets certain confessions with a stillness that does not bend. They notice that guilt does not move through you as easily as it once did. Their disappointment is immediate, but their interpretation is primitive. They call you changed because they cannot imagine that the earlier arrangement was built on injury. This is why the empath is so often misunderstood at the very moment the truth becomes irreversible. So long as you carry, you are praised in subtle ways, not openly. For open praise would expose the transaction, but through dependence, through expectation, through the familiar relaxation that appears in others when they feel your readiness to receive what they do not wish to bear. Yet, the moment that receptivity closes, the same people experience not your humanity, but their own deprivation. They do not say, "You have reached your limit." They say, "You are no longer yourself." But the self they refer to was never whole. It was adaptive. The tragedy is not merely that you carried too much. The deeper tragedy is that carrying became the proof of your goodness, and once goodness has been fused with burden, the psyche begins to fear its own boundary. To stop absorbing feels, at first, like cruelty. To decline the transfer feels like betrayal. To leave another person with their own sorrow feels almost immoral. This is one of the most destructive confusions in the emotional life of the empath. The belief that love is measured by how much pain one can hold without protest. Again and again in my patience, I observed that what passes for devotion is often a concealed arrangement with suffering. One becomes necessary by becoming porous. One becomes valued by becoming available to psychic invasion. And because this arrangement often begins early inside family structures where the child learns that harmony depends upon his or her sensitivity, it acquires the force of destiny. You do not merely repeat the pattern, you mistake it for character. This is why the collapse is so disorienting. It is not simply a change in behavior. It is the failure of an identity that organized itself around invisible labor. When you can no longer take in what others expel, you do not immediately discover freedom. You first encounter vacancy. The old role falls away, and beneath it there is not yet a new form, only silence where compulsion once lived. That silence is often mistaken for emptiness. It is not emptiness, it is unoccupied psychic ground. Most people cannot recognize this. They interpret unoccupied ground as indifference because they themselves are accustomed to relation through use. They know intimacy only in forms that require access, explanation, responsiveness, and emotional compliance. When those conditions disappear, they assume something essential has died between you. In a sense, they are right, but not in the way they believe. What has died is not your feeling. What has died is your automatic cooperation with what injures you. That is why their confusion is so severe. They still sense your depth. They still sense your intelligence, your perception, your capacity for feeling, but the old hallway is gone. They walk toward the familiar door and find it closed. They speak in the tone that once opened you and receive only a measured response. They bring you the same suffering in the same form and find that it no longer enters you. It meets a surface, not a hard surface, a real one. This is often the first time in your life that your own psyche becomes a place others cannot simply move through. The cost of carrying others' pain is therefore not only exhaustion, it is the delayed birth of boundary through collapse. The boundary comes late because the psyche, having been used as passage for too long, must harden where it should have differentiated earlier. And when boundary arrives late, it is often experienced by others as shocking, even excessive. They are meeting all at once. The accumulated force of every limit that was never permitted to form. Here anger enters, though not always in recognizable form. Many empaths imagine anger as noise, confrontation, eruption. But there is another kind of anger, colder and more decisive, which does not shout because it no longer seeks negotiation. It withdraws permission, it ceases to interpret, it refuses to translate injury into understanding. This anger is frequently misunderstood because it bears no theatrical signs, yet it is often the first truly moral movement in a psyche that has spent years confusing sacrifice with virtue. In my work on the shadow, I saw repeatedly that the qualities a person most fears in himself are often the very forces required for psychic survival. A certain hardness, certain refusal, a certain capacity to leave another person to his own interior consequences. These may appear, from the standpoint of adaptation, as betrayal, but from the standpoint of the self, they are often overdue. The empath who has carried too much does not merely need rest, he needs access to the disowned force that says no without apology. This is why the collapse of carrying is never merely relational, it is shadow material emerging under pressure, the part of you that was once condemned as selfish, cold, distant, or unkind begins to appear not as corruption, but as corrective. At first, this feels almost unnatural. You watch yourself remain still in moments where you once would have rushed in. You hear yourself leave a sentence unanswered, not from confusion, but from refusal to become the container again. You feel the old guilt rise, but it does not master you as before. Something stronger has begun to stand behind it. And this is precisely the point at which social mislabeling intensifies, because others do not experience your boundary as a private psychic correction. They experience it as loss. They may call you harsh when you are merely no longer absorbent. They may call you arrogant when you no longer collapse into explanation. They may accuse you of becoming difficult, detached, inaccessible, changed, beyond recognition. What they are saying beneath the language is far simpler. You no longer carry them the way you once did. A person can forgive almost anything except the withdrawal of an invisible service on which his inner comfort depended. So they search for causes. They imagine someone has influenced you. They imagine you are punishing them. They imagine you are wounded and acting out. Rarely do they imagine the truth that the old system reached its end because it was incompatible with psychic life. They cannot imagine it because to do so would require them to confront their participation in that system. And most people would rather pathologize your boundary than recognize their dependence on your overfunctioning. There is a cruelty in this, though it is not always conscious, for the empath is often expected to remain morally legible even while carrying what would deform another person entirely. You were expected to feel endlessly without becoming altered by what you felt. Expected to absorb contradiction without developing hardness. Expected to receive projection without withdrawing from intimacy. Expected to hold grief, rage, confusion, fear again and again while somehow preserving warmth in its original form. This expectation is not humane. It is parasitic. And still, because the empath's adaptations are so refined, he often collaborates with the arrangement long after he has begun to inwardly disappear. That disappearance is subtle. It appears first in the thinning of desire, then in the inability to name what one truly wants, then in the fading of spontaneous feeling, because every feeling has been interrupted by the necessity of receiving another's. Eventually the person becomes skilled at emotional accommodation and estranged from his own center. This estrangement is one of the hidden costs of carrying not only that you become tired, but that you become foreign to yourself. I once wrote, in essence, that when the ego is too exclusively adapted to outer necessity, the inner life retaliates. It does not do so nobly. It does so by symptom, by fatigue, by emotional deadening, by inexplicable aversion, by dreams in which the architecture of the soul appears damaged or inaccessible. The psyche speaks last, but when it does, it speaks with finality. This is why so many who have carried others' pain begin, at a certain point, to dream of houses they cannot enter, rooms they have forgotten, voices that call from behind doors which never open. The dream does not say, "You need balance." It says something more severe. Parts of your inner structure have been sealed off because they could no longer remain exposed to collective demand. And there is shame in this. At first, not because the event is shameful in itself, but because the old identity cannot survive without accusing the new boundary of betrayal. You may find yourself wondering whether you have become less loving, whether the stillness in you is evidence of damage, whether the inability to feel for others in the old immediate way means that something essential has gone missing. But these doubts emerge from the remains of a structure that mistook self-erasure for depth. Depth is not erasure, nor is goodness the ability to be entered without limit. What you are meeting now is not the loss of soul, but the end of compliance, disguised as compassion. This distinction is difficult because the two have long occupied the same gestures, the same soft voice, the same patience, the same capacity to understand even what harms you. But understanding is not absolution, nor does insight require surrender. One of the final deceptions of overdeveloped empathy is the belief that to see another person clearly obligates you to carry what you see. It does not, and when that false obligation begins to die, the entire moral atmosphere around you changes. People who once felt innocent in your presence begin to feel exposed, not because you accuse them, because you no longer participate in the mechanism that protected them from the weight of themselves. You do not soften reality for them. You do not translate their injury into tragedy. You do not volunteer your own interior space as a place of discharge. This is profoundly unsettling to those who were accustomed to emotional relief in your company. Their discomfort is often the first honest mirror in the situation. Not your guilt, their discomfort. It reveals the degree to which your carrying had become functional for them. It reveals how much of the relationship rested on your capacity to absorb asymmetry. It reveals that what they called closeness may have depended less on reciprocity than on your willingness to be entered, interpreted, and used as a site of psychic regulation. Once that function collapses, the relationship is forced to reveal its actual structure. Some survive this, many do not. This is why the end of carrying often produces a strange loneliness. Even when it is necessary, you do not simply lose the role, you lose the world built around the role. Conversations shift, expectations harden into resentment. Certain bonds, once maintained by your hidden labor, begin to wither almost immediately. And because the change in you is inward and difficult to explain, others imagine the rupture came without cause. They do not see the years that prepared it. They see only the day the door did not open. But the day the door did not open was never the beginning. It was only the first visible sign that the cost had already been paid. There is a point beyond which the psyche does not attempt to repair the old arrangement. It does not renegotiate, does not soften, does not return to the earlier fluidity in which everything could pass through you without resistance. What once felt like openness begins to reveal itself, in retrospect, as exposure without boundary. And once this recognition stabilizes, even slightly, the internal movement changes direction. It no longer moves outward in anticipation of others. It begins slowly and without announcement to gather inward. This inward gathering is not warmth, it is consolidation. You begin to notice that your attention, which once extended automatically toward the emotional states of others, now hesitates before leaving you. It poses, it measures, it does not rush to fill the silence, it does not lean forward to bridge the gap. And in that pause, something unfamiliar appears, a sense that your inner space is no longer available for immediate occupation. It belongs in a way it never did before. To you, this is not experienced as comfort, it is experienced as strangeness. For a long time, your identity depended upon permeability. You knew yourself through response, through what you could sense, to hold, translate, and neutralize in others. Without that constant outward extension, you are left with an interior that does not immediately reveal itself. It is quieter than you expected, more opaque, less eager to become defined through interaction, and because you have been trained to locate yourself through the needs of others, this quiet interior may at first feel like absence. But it is not absence, it is uncolonized territory. The difficulty is that you do not yet know how to inhabit it. The old habits remain active, even as the structure that supported them has collapsed. You may still feel the impulse to move toward another's distress, to anticipate, to adjust, to open the familiar hallway through which their emotions can pass, but when you attempt this, something in you does not cooperate. The movement begins and then stops, as if encountering a boundary that cannot be crossed from within. This creates a peculiar internal tension. The adaptive reflex is still present, but the psychic ground that once sustained it has withdrawn. You are left between two systems, one that still remembers how to carry, and one that has already decided not to. This is often where the sensation of hardness appears, not as cruelty, as density. You may feel it in your chest, or in the way your breath no longer softens in response to another's voice. You may notice that certain words, which once would have drawn you closer, now pass through you without effect. There is no hostility in this, no deliberate withdrawal, only a lack of movement where movement once defined you. Others perceive this immediately. They may not know how to name it, but they feel the change in contact, the subtle leaning in that once met their emotional expression is gone. In its place is a presence that does not adjust itself to maintain their comfort. This presence is not aggressive, it does not impose, but it also does not yield. And this is where the deeper disturbance begins, because most people are accustomed to relationships in which at least one party absorbs more than the other. This imbalance is rarely acknowledged, but it is widely practiced. When the empath ceases to carry, the balance shifts abruptly. The other person is forced, often for the first time, to encounter the full weight of his own interior without assistance, and this encounter is rarely welcomed. Instead, it is projected outward. You become, in their perception, the source of discomfort. They may say you are distant, that you no longer care, that something essential in you has hardened, but what they are responding to is not your indifference, it is the sudden absence of the mechanism that once protected them from themselves. They are feeling, in your presence, what they previously deposited into you. This is profoundly unsettling, and because it is unsettling, they seek to restore the previous arrangement. They may become more expressive, more demanding, more insistent. They may attempt to draw you back into the old role by intensifying their emotional display, or they may withdraw in resentment, interpreting your new stillness as rejection. In either case, the dynamic reveals itself. What was once hidden becomes visible. The relationship was never equal. It was regulated through you. In my work with the shadow, I observed that when a projection is no longer accepted by its host, it returns to its origin with increased intensity. The person who projected it experiences this return not as self-recognition, but as external threat. He feels, suddenly, that something in the other has changed, become cold, inaccessible, even dangerous. But the danger does not originate in you. It originates in the sudden proximity of what he had previously expelled. This is why the empath, upon ceasing to carry, is often perceived as unsettling, not because you have become more severe, because you no longer dilute what others feel in your presence. You reflect it without intention, without commentary, without absorbing it. The mirror appears where there was once a passage, and the mirror does not negotiate, it does not soften the image, it does not interpret, it simply returns what stands before it. This is experienced by many as judgment, even when no judgment is present. For most people are not accustomed to encountering themselves without mediation. They rely, often unconsciously, on the empathic function in others to translate their experience into something more tolerable. When that translation ceases, the raw form of their own interior becomes visible, and visibility, when unprepared for, feels like exposure. This is why some will accuse you of becoming critical even when you say nothing. They sense that you are no longer participating in the subtle agreement to protect them from the full impact of their own behavior. They sense that you are no longer rearranging your perception to preserve their image of themselves. And this, more than anything, destabilizes the relationship, for what is threatened is not affection, it is illusion. There is a second dream that often accompanies this stage. You stand before a mirror, expecting to see your own reflection, but the mirror does not return your image. Instead, it shows the room behind you with perfect clarity, while your own figure is absent. You move, and the room moves with you, but you do not appear. This dream expresses a profound psychological reversal. For much of your life, you were the one who reflected others. Your inner surface adjusted continuously to hold their image, their feeling, their unspoken content, your own presence. In this process, became indistinct. You existed as a function of reflection, but now the mirror no longer includes you, not because you are gone, because you are no longer available as surface. Your presence withdraws from the act of reflecting others, and in doing so, it also withdraws from immediate self-recognition. There is a period in which you cannot easily see yourself, because the old mode of self-experience through response to others has ended. This is the deeper cost, not only that relationships change, but that your own sense of self must reorganize without the familiar feedback loop of carrying and being needed. It is here that many attempt to return, not consciously, but through subtle reactivation of the old role. You may feel the impulse to re-engage, to soften again, to reopen the door just enough to restore the previous rhythm, not because you desire the burden, but because the absence of it has left you in unfamiliar territory. The old structure, though painful, was known. It provided orientation, identity, and a sense of place within the relational field. Without it, you are undefined. And the human psyche often prefers painful definition to undefined existence. But the return, if attempted, does not succeed in the same way. The capacity to carry has already been compromised. You may take in a portion of what you once could absorb entirely, but it does not settle as before. It creates pressure, resistance, even aversion. The psyche signals clearly now that the previous arrangement cannot be restored without damage, and so the attempt fails, not dramatically, quietly. You listen, but something in you remains separate. You understand, but you do not internalize. You respond, but the response does not open into absorption. There is a distance that cannot be crossed from either side. This is when the realization deepens. What has ended is not a behavior, but a capacity. The empath often fears that this means the loss of love, but love, as it was previously experienced, was intertwined with carrying. It was measured by how much you could take in without refusal. Now, as that capacity diminishes, love must detach from burden or disappear entirely. This detachment is not immediate. It occurs slowly through repeated encounters in which you remain present without absorbing, and in these encounters, a different form of relation begins to emerge, not softer, more exact. You begin to perceive others without the immediate impulse to adjust your inner state to accommodate them. You see their patterns, their repetitions, their contradictions, without translating them into responsibility. This perception is often clearer than anything you experienced before, because it is no longer filtered through the necessity of carrying, but it is also more difficult to share, because it does not come with the softening that once made your insights acceptable. You become, in a sense, more accurate and less usable. This is the paradox that defines this stage. The very qualities that deepen your perception reduce your function within relationships that depended on distortion. You are no longer able to sustain the emotional environment that allowed those relationships to exist in their previous form, and so they begin to shift, fracture, or dissolve. Some will adapt. They will feel the boundary, and instead of resisting it, they will adjust themselves. They will begin, perhaps slowly, to carry more of their own interior. These relationships may survive. Though they will not resemble what they were, they will be quieter, for more deliberate, less fused. They will require a different kind of presence, one that does not depend on your absorption, but on mutual recognition. But many will not adapt. They will experience your boundary as loss and respond accordingly. Some will withdraw, seeking elsewhere the function you once provided. Some will remain, but with a persistent tension, as if waiting for you to return to a role you can no longer inhabit. Some will attempt to negotiate, to reason, to appeal to your former identity, but the structure that supported that identity has already collapsed, and so the negotiations fail, not because you refuse, because there is nothing left to negotiate with. The door, once open without condition, has become something else entirely, not locked, no longer a door. What remains, after all of this, is not a restoration of balance, but a different order of existence. The psyche does not return to what it was before the years of carrying. It cannot. Too much has been revealed, too much has been sealed. The structures that once allowed you to remain open without limit have been dismantled from within, not as an act of will, but as the final consequence of prolonged use. And so you find yourself standing in a configuration that does not resemble the life you once recognized as yours. You are still present, but the way presence moves has changed. There is no longer that immediate outward leaning, that reflexive extension into the emotional field of others. Your attention does not rush to meet what appears. It stays at first where it originates. It observes before it engages. It measures without anxiety. It allows the other to remain with what they bring, without the subtle intervention that once defined your way of relating. This creates a new atmosphere around you, not hostile, but exact. People feel it as a shift in gravity. They cannot move as freely within your presence as they once did. There is no longer an unspoken permission to deposit what they cannot hold. The space does not receive them in the same way. It is not open to accommodate imbalance. It does not rearrange itself to preserve their comfort. And so they encounter themselves more directly. Some turn away, some become uneasy, some attempt, one final time, to reach for the old entrance, to speak in the tones that once opened you, to evoke the response that made you accessible, but the structure is gone. There is no passage behind the surface they remember, only a form that appears similar but does not function as before. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to explain this. In the past, you would have searched for language. You would have tried to translate your inner state into something the other could understand, something that would soften the impact of your boundary, something that would allow the relationship to adjust without rupture. But now, language itself seems insufficient, not because you cannot speak, but because what has changed is not communicable within the framework that once existed between you. There is nothing to negotiate. There is only what is, and what is does not include the previous arrangement. This absence of explanation is often the most disturbing element for others. They are accustomed to narratives that justify change. They expect reasons, stories, causes that can be debated or corrected. But when you do not provide these, when you remain still in the face of their demand for clarity, they are left without the usual tools of repair. They cannot argue with your boundary if it is not presented as a position. They cannot persuade you to return if you are not actively refusing the encounter. Instead, something impersonal, a fact, and facts, when they contradict expectation, are rarely accepted without resistance. There is often a final phase in which the other attempts to assign meaning to your change. They may decide that you have become cold, that you no longer care, that you have withdrawn your love. They may interpret your stillness as indifference, your lack of response as distance, your refusal to absorb as rejection. These interpretations are not accurate, but they are necessary for them. They allow the other to preserve a sense of coherence in the face of a dynamic that no longer conforms to their understanding. You do not correct them, not because you agree, because correction would imply a return to explanation, and explanation would imply that the relationship still operates within a field where mutual understanding can restore access, but access is not what has been lost. What has been lost is the mechanism that allowed access to occur without cost, and that mechanism does not return. This is the quiet finality of the process, not dramatized, not declared, but absolute. You continue to move through your life, but the way others meet you is altered. Some relationships fall away without conflict, simply because the conditions that sustain them are no longer present. Others persist, but in reduced form, stripped of the intensity that once defined them. A few may deepen, but only if they are capable of reorganizing themselves around a different principle. In these remaining connections, something new appears, not warmth in the old sense, but clarity. You are no longer divided between what you feel and what you must absorb. You are no longer required to translate another's inner state into your own. You can perceive without becoming permeable. You can remain present without becoming responsible. This is not detachment as avoidance. It is detachment as structure, and structure, though often mistaken for coldness, is the condition for any form of real relation. Without it, there is only fusion. And fusion, as you now know, erasis, the absence of fusion reveals something else as well, the extent to which your previous life was organized around invisible labor. The conversations, the connections, the sense of closeness, all of it rested, to a degree that was never fully acknowledged, on your willingness to absorb what others could not. When that willingness disappears, the entire configuration must either transform or dissolve. Most dissolve, not because they were false, because they were unsustainable. This recognition may come with a kind of grief that is difficult to name, not grief for specific individuals, though that may be present, but grief for the entire structure of meaning that once surrounded you. You realize, gradually, that much of what you experienced as intimacy was dependent on your ability to be entered without limit. And when that ability ends, the intimacy does not remain in the same form. It cannot. Something else must take its place, but that something else does not arrive immediately. There is a period, sometimes long, in which the new structure has not yet fully formed. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet stabilized in what you are becoming. This is often experienced as isolation, though it is not isolation in the conventional sense. You are still connected to others, you still speak, still engage, still participate. But the underlying dynamic has shifted so completely that the familiar sense of belonging does not return. You are present in a different way, less accessible, more defined. This definition does not feel, at first, like strength. It feels like limit, but limit is precisely what was missing. And without limit, there can be no self. In my observations of individuation, I saw that the emergence of true boundary is often accompanied by a temporary loss of relational certainty. The individual must learn to exist without the continuous feedback that once defined his place within the social field. He must tolerate being misunderstood, misread, even rejected, while the new structure stabilizes. This is not a failure of adaptation. It is a necessary condition for differentiation. Differentiation is not celebrated by the collective. It is resisted because it interrupts the unconscious agreements that maintain relational equilibrium. When one person ceases to perform his assigned function, the entire system is forced to reorganize, and systems resist reorganization. You have already felt this resistance in the subtle tension that appears in conversations, in the hesitation of others when they approach you, in the way certain people withdraw without explanation, in the way others linger, uncertain, as if waiting for something familiar to return. Nothing returns, and you no longer wait for it. This is the final shift, not the withdrawal of care, but the end of expectation. You do not expect others to change. You do not expect the past to reassemble itself in a more sustainable form. You do not expect to recover the version of yourself that could carry without limit. That version is not hidden, it is finished, and in its place, something quieter, more precise, more contained, continues. It does not seek to be understood. It does not seek to be needed. It does not organize itself around the pain of others. It remains, with or without recognition. This is the cost that was never named when you first learned to carry, not that you would become exhausted, but that, in the end, you would become unavailable to the very function that once defined you. And with that, every structure built upon it would quietly come apart. What has completed inside you is the end of your availability as a place for others to leave what they refuse to carry.